In this video, I'll be comparing Resident Evil 4 Remake with Resident Evil Village to see which one is better. Starting off with the gameplay, Resident Evil Village gives you a first-person perspective where the protagonist gets his hands chopped all the damn time. With that perspective, you have a slower movement, and that immerses you much more into this world. However, there is also a third-person perspective that has been added to the game, which makes it a little better, I guess. While there is definitely a lot of action in the game, especially when you arrive at the village, you still don't have a ton of enemy to fight through. And because of it, the gunplay is also slower as compared to other FPS games. So that sort of creates a balance. But at the same time, you don't have a lot of ammo and resources, so you have to look around to find more ammo, find medkits, and stuff like that. Since Ethan is a weaker protagonist, the only thing he can do is block using his hands. And that somehow works. On the other hand, Resident Evil 4 Remake gives you a third-person perspective and a protagonist who has been trained all his life. So with that, the gameplay feels faster, and since you have been trained, you can do kicks and suplex enemies by shooting at their legs. The game also brings you tons of action, unlike a Village. You get a lot of enemies coming at you in various moments of the game, and you have to deal with them accordingly. But there are many moments in the game where you are escorting Ashley. So you're not only protecting yourself, but also Ashley. But thanks to the remake, Ashley is not as annoying as the original game, so it sort of helps. But both the games are very similar because Resident Evil Village was inspired very heavily from the original Resident Evil 4. So both the games have a village fight section, a castle, both protagonists are trying to rescue someone, and they also have the main enemy who has turned everyone to aid them and also who seeks power. But overall, if you take a look at gameplay, it's quite easy to say that Resident Evil takes the win. Moving on to the environment. Both the games have spookier environment, but Resident Evil Village feels less scarier than Resident Evil 4 Remake. Resident Evil Village definitely gives a vibe of unhappiness, but the environment looks really cool, especially the castle because that stands out the most in the game. It is incredible to walk around in this amazingly detailed castle. It looks beautiful in every corner. Not only that, the enemies there, they are also very beautiful. But it's not just the castle because every single location in the game is incredible. From House Beneviento to the lake where Moreau lives to Heisenberg's farm and the underground lair. Everything looks incredible and gives a different vibe on how each boss is. Resident Evil Remake, on the other hand, gives a more spookier vibe. Because of the new lighting and engine, everything feels scarier and it gives you a feeling that you want to get out of there as quickly as you can. And since the game is based on Spain, the details and the environment looks really incredible and old school at the same time. But both the games have really great environments and it's very hard to decide, but in my opinion, Resident Evil Village gets a small victory here. But the biggest reason why Resident Evil is popular is because of horror. And while both the games have some horror moments, Resident Evil Village is a little less scarier than Resident Evil 4 Remake. Although Resident Evil Village does have that one House Beneviento, which is the scariest thing of the game, other than that, the game never scares you. Even though you're being chased by Lady Dimitrescu and her daughters, they are more taken as a sex symbol. So everybody wants them to chase you, which is the weirdest thing that has happened in Resident Evil history. The rest of the game is completely action-packed with multiple bosses and puzzles. However, its DLC, Village of Rose, is much scarier, putting you in a third-person perspective where you are in the same location with creepier enemies and completely lights out. And the best part is the protagonist is still figuring out what she has to do, and that adds vulnerability, which is great for horror games. But speaking of Resident Evil 4 Remake, what sells the most is the atmosphere. As I mentioned, the game happens at night. It's able to have that atmosphere where there are no lights and there's light wind. There are definitely certain moments which are scarier than the others, especially when you go underground or through caves. But unlike Village, it doesn't give you a scary moment because you are mostly scared by the enemies around you. Whether it's the Regenerators, the Verdugo, or the Ganados themselves, you are scared from where they're gonna come up and pop up. So there's that adrenaline that builds up this tension. That is exactly why Resident Evil 4 Remake has a little bit better horror. Next up is boss battle, which is a big thing in Resident Evil, and both the games have incredible bosses, so it's gonna be tough. But believe it or not, many boss fights in Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil 4 Remake are very similar. For example, the Moreau boss fight in Village and Del Lago boss fight in Resident Evil 4 Remake. Both the boss fights happens at a lake and both the bosses are big mammals. However, Moreau boss fight starts at the lake and then ends up on the land where you have to use guns and mines and even explosives to kill it. Whereas in Resident Evil 4 Remake, you are just sitting on a boat and throwing spears to kill Del Lago. Another boss fight which is quite similar is Resident Evil Village's Sturm and Resident Evil 4 Remake Garrador. Both the bosses can see you but charge at you when they hear noise, and both can be killed by shooting from the back. The Sturm in Resident Evil Village is a boss battle, whereas Garrador in Resident Evil 4 Remake is a mini-boss battle. And you don't fight him once, but twice. And in the second time, they're not one, but two. And also armored, so it's kind of a fun challenge in Resident Evil 4 Remake. To be honest, it's quite hard to pick one because both the games have some incredible boss moments. I believe that Resident Evil 4 Remake takes a small piece of victory here because the boss battles are quite memorable. And now comes the story, and both the games have some interesting story. Resident Evil 4 Remake is quite straightforward in its story. The protagonist Leon has to rescue President's daughter Ashley from this location in Spain, and with that he faces lots of problems. He gets to meet lots of new people, and at one point he also gets infected. Whereas in Resident Evil Village, the story becomes a little bit complicated, especially towards the end. Even though the basic premise is Ethan trying to get back his daughter who is kidnapped, again similar to Resident Evil 4 Remake, it does have quite a twist towards the end. As a character in Resident Evil Village, you never get to see the face of the protagonist Ethan. Capcom wanted to make sure that Ethan is just any ordinary character trying to save his family. The character doesn't have much of a personality, and not a lot of people really like this character as much as any other character in the Resident Evil games. Out of the entire game, Lady Dimitrescu and maybe her daughters have been the most memorable, because quite honestly they are taken as a sex symbol. But other than that, Heisenberg was the character that has the most charisma in my opinion, and it was wonderful meeting him and also killing him. On the other hand, Resident Evil 4 Remake's characters are quite memorable, with the protagonist Leon being the most popular in the entire Resident Evil franchise. Also, other characters such as Ada, Ashley, Luis, Krauser, Salazar, Sadler, and even Dr. Salvador are quite memorable. And it's always fun to see the interaction between Ada and Leon. Luis in this remake especially has an interesting bond with Leon that was just not present in the original that I appreciate a hell lot more. While the story of Resident Evil 4 Remake is quite straightforward, its characters are very memorable, and that in some ways makes the story pretty enjoyable. However, in Resident Evil Village, even though the story does have a little turn towards the end, its characters are not as memorable, other than the enemies of course. But because they're not so memorable, the story is not as enjoyable as compared to Resident Evil 4 Remake. And that's why Resident Evil 4 Remake takes the win here as well. But it looks like it's 4-1 between Resident Evil 4 Remake and Resident Evil Village. And with that, Resident Evil 4 Remake gets the win. This was a comparison, but when you play these games separately, you will actually have a lot of fun. Both the games have incredible action, horror, and some great characters as well. But the original Resident Evil 4 and now the remake is celebrated for a reason. Well, check this video out to know, is Resident Evil 4 Remake actually overrated?